The Siege of Athens, Sparta's final victory. By 405 BCE, after nearly 3 decades of fierce conflict, Athens was a shadow of its former self. The once mighty city-state, which had built an empire stretching across the Aegean and prided itself on its cultural and democratic ideals, was now weakened and isolated. The Peloponnesian War had drained its resources, depleted its manpower, and left its people weary and desperate. All that remained was a final, crushing blow. This came in the form of the Siege of Athens, led by the relentless Spartan general Lysander. This siege would mark the end of Athenian power and confirm Sparta's place as the new hegemon of Greece. Part 1. The prelude to the siege, the Battle of Aegospotami. The seeds of Athens' defeat were sown at the Battle of Aegospotami in 405 BCE. Under the command of Lysander, Sparta had managed to trap and destroy the Athenian navy in a single devastating blow. With nearly 180 Athenian ships destroyed, Athens was left without a fleet to defend its trade routes or bring in supplies from its allies. The city's strategic advantage was gone, and with it, its ability to control the Aegean Sea. Lysander wasted no time in capitalizing on his victory. He moved swiftly, capturing Athenian territories and compelling Athenian allies to surrender to Sparta. The Delian League, the coalition that had once allowed Athens to dominate the Aegean, dissolved as one city-state after another abandoned the beleaguered empire. For Athens, this was more than just a military loss. It was the collapse of its empire, the end of its dreams of dominance, and the beginning of a desperate struggle for survival. Part 2. The Blockade and Starvation. With Athens isolated, Lysander positioned the Spartan fleet at Piraeus, Athens' crucial port and lifeline to the outside world. The blockade at Piraeus was brutal and effective. Spartan ships patrolled the waters, cutting off all trade and supply routes, preventing any grain, food, or essential goods from reaching the city. As the months wore on, the Athenians began to feel the full impact of starvation. Inside the city walls, despair grew. Athens' famed long walls, the defensive fortifications that connected the city to its port, were now a symbol of entrapment rather than protection. The walls, which had once been the pride of Athens, were now little more than barriers holding the starving citizens within. Hunger, disease, and fear became rampant as supplies dwindled, and the people realized that without outside help, they would face a slow, inevitable death. As conditions worsened, political divisions deepened. Some Athenians, weary of the war and desperate to save themselves, urged the assembly to negotiate peace with Sparta. Others, clinging to the hope of Athenian resilience and fearing the terms Sparta might impose, argued for continued resistance. But with each passing day, as the people grew weaker and food became scarcer, it became clear that Athens' options were running out. Part 3. The Failure of Allies and the Loneliness of Defeat. Athens had once been at the center of a vast network of allies, bound together by the Delian League. But with its navy destroyed and its empire in ruins, Athens could no longer rely on support from these former allies. Many city-states, resentful of Athenian dominance, had already defected to Sparta, unwilling to risk their own destruction for a city that could no longer protect them. Persia, which had supported Sparta financially throughout the war, was now backing the Spartan efforts to eliminate Athens as a threat. The great powers that Athens had once rivaled or even bested in battle now stood by, watching the city's suffering with indifference. The once unbreakable spirit of Athens faced the harsh reality of loneliness in defeat. For the first time in generations, Athens had no allies to turn to, no resources to draw upon, and no navy to defend itself. Part 4. The Surrender of Athens. By early 404 BCE, the situation in Athens had become unbearable. Starvation, disease, and despair had taken their toll on the city's population. The assembly finally recognized that surrender was the only viable option left. Representatives were sent to Lysander, who delivered the terms of Athens' surrender on behalf of Sparta. The terms were harsh and symbolic. Athens was forced to dismantle its long walls, the very fortifications that had protected it for so long, brick by brick, under the watchful eyes of Spartan soldiers. The dismantling was intended to signify the end of Athenian dominance and serve as a reminder to other Greek city-states of the dangers of overreaching ambition. Athens was also required to surrender its remaining warships, leaving it defenseless and unable to threaten Sparta or rebuild its empire. The Delian League was officially dissolved, and Athens was compelled to accept a Spartan-appointed oligarchy known as the 30 Tyrants, an oppressive regime that would govern the city under Spartan influence. These tyrants ruled with an iron fist, exiling, imprisoning, and executing those they deemed a threat to their authority. For the citizens of Athens, who had long prided themselves on their democratic freedoms, the rule of the 30 tyrants was a bitter reminder of their fall from grace. Part 5: The Triumph and Cost of Spartan Victory. With Athens defeated, Sparta had achieved what it had set out to do: to dismantle the Athenian Empire and secure its place as the dominant power in Greece. Sparta's victory seemed complete. Yet, the cost of this triumph would soon become apparent. Though Sparta now reigned supreme, the responsibilities of leadership in a fractured, war-torn Greek world would strain its limited resources and challenge its traditional values. Sparta, a society built on isolationism and strict military discipline, was ill-prepared to manage an empire. Its allies, particularly Corinth and Thebes, grew increasingly resentful of Spartan dominance, fearing that Sparta would turn Athens' former imperial ambitions against them. Meanwhile, the brutal rule of the 30 tyrants in Athens bred resentment and resistance among the Athenian populace, leading to uprisings that would eventually restore democracy. The constant need to maintain control over Greece and the concessions made to Persia to secure victory over Athens left Sparta vulnerable. In the years that followed, rebellions and new alliances would form to challenge Sparta's hegemony, leading to further conflict and, ultimately, to Sparta's own decline. Part 6: The Restoration of Democracy in Athens. In 403 BCE, after a year under the oppressive rule of the 30 tyrants, the people of Athens rose up in defiance. Led by the democratic general Thrasybulus, Athenian exiles returned to the city and, with support from the people, managed to overthrow the oligarchic government imposed by Sparta. Democracy was restored in Athens, and the city began the arduous process of rebuilding its institutions and society. Though weakened and humbled, Athens found a renewed sense of purpose. The restoration of democracy, despite the city's diminished power, was a symbolic victory for Athenian ideals. Athens would never again command the vast empire it had before the war, but its cultural and intellectual legacy would endure. The city continued to flourish as a center of philosophy, art, and education, producing thinkers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, whose ideas would shape the foundations of Western thought. Part 7: The Legacy of the Siege and the Lessons of the Peloponnesian War. The siege of Athens and the fall of its empire marked the end of the Peloponnesian War, but the conflict left Greece divided, weakened, and vulnerable. The war, which had initially been a struggle for dominance between two powerful city-states, had devastated the Greek world, sowing distrust and animosity among the city-states. The absence of a unifying power or a stable alliance left Greece susceptible to external influence and conquest. The lessons of the siege and the war itself were many. For Athens, it was a humbling reminder of the dangers of overreach, the perils of hubris, and the fragility of empire. The siege demonstrated that even the most formidable walls and powerful navies could not secure a city from the consequences of ambition unchecked by restraint. For Sparta, the victory revealed the limitations of military power as a tool for governance. Though it had won the war, it could not hold Greece together, and its harsh rule only served to deepen divisions. The Peloponnesian War, culminating in the Siege of Athens, underscored the tragic consequences of Greek disunity. In the years that followed, the Greek city-states would continue to clash, eventually paving the way for the rise of Macedon under Philip II and the later conquests of his son, Alexander the Great. The Greek world, weakened by decades of internal strife, would fall under Macedonian rule, losing its political independence but preserving its cultural influence. Conclusion: a legacy of resilience and reflection. The Siege of Athens was a decisive moment in Greek history, symbolizing the end of Athenian imperial power and the victory of Spartan military might. But while Sparta won the war, the spirit of Athens endured. The city's resilience, even after its fall, reflected the strength of its democratic